14 years. That's how long she spent pretending the rusted gates of Ashwood Farm didn't exist. Her grandmother hadn't wanted her, leaving her to the foster system without a backward glance. Now, the old woman was dead. All she left behind was a decaying house, 90 acres of dead soil, and a secret worth $15 million. The brass keys felt heavy, coated in a fine layer of green oxidation that smelled like old pennies. Jessica sat in the cramped office of a probate lawyer who looked like he survived exclusively on black coffee and antacids. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, a high-pitched drone that set her teeth on edge. She hadn't bothered to change out of her work clothes. The faded canvas jacket and steel-toed boots she wore for her shifts at the fulfillment center were practically glued to her at this point. She was 28, exhausted down to the marrow of her bones, and entirely out of place in a room with mahogany trim. "She left no other beneficiaries, Ms. Miller," the lawyer, Neil Reed, said. He slid a manila folder across the desk. It caught on a staple, tearing slightly. "The property's yours, free and clear." Jess stared at the folder. She didn't reach for it. "Margaret hated me. She locked the screen door while the social worker was still walking me down the porch steps. Why would she leave me anything?" Neil sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. People get complicated at the end. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a lack of alternatives. The state doesn't care about her motives, and frankly, neither do I. The farm is in your name. 90 acres, a farmhouse, 2 barns. He paused, putting his glasses back on. "It's in rough shape. The property taxes were paid up through the year. But beyond that, you're on your own." "Sell it," Jess said immediately. "I don't want it. Put it on the market. Let some developer bulldoze it and build a strip mall." "You need to clear it out first," Neil replied, leaning back in his squeaking leather chair. "It's packed to the rafters with decades of, well, life. Buyers want an empty property, not a museum of someone else's hoarding. Go out there, see what's worth keeping, what's worth pawning, then call me." 2 hours later, Jess was driving her battered Honda Civic down a cracked 2-lane highway. The sky overhead was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening rain that couldn't quite commit to falling. The heater in the car was broken, blowing lukewarm air that tasted like exhaust. When she finally pulled onto the gravel driveway of Ashwood Farm, she killed the engine. The silence that rushed in to fill the cabin was suffocating. She stepped out into the damp chill. The house was a 2-story Victorian that had once been painted a crisp, proud white. Now the paint peeled in long, dead strips, exposing the gray, rotting wood underneath. The porch sagged under the weight of overgrown ivy. To the left, the main barn stood at a dangerous angle, its roof caved in like a crushed rib cage. The fields stretching out behind the property were a tangled mess of brown weeds and dead thistle. It was a monument to stubbornness and decay, just like Margaret. Jess walked up the porch steps. They groaned in protest. She slid the heavy brass key into the front door. The lock was stiff. She had to put her shoulder into the warped oak, jiggling the key until the mechanism finally gave way with a sharp clack. The smell hit her instantly. Dried lavender, stale dust, and the sharp, acidic tang of decaying paper. She stood in the foyer, her boots leaving imprints in the thick layer of dust on the hardwood floor. Everything was exactly as it had been 14 years ago. The tall grandfather clock stood in the corner, its pendulum dead and motionless. The faded floral sofa sat in the living room, draped in a thin, yellowed sheet. Jess walked through the rooms, feeling like an intruder in a tomb. She didn't feel grief. She checked her chest for it, like you check your pockets for your keys. But there was nothing there, just a cold, hard knot of resentment. When her father died of a fentanyl overdose, Jess was 14. Margaret had stood in this very hallway, looking at Jess with eyes like chips of flint. "You have his blood," the old woman had said. "I won't let it poison this house." And that was it. A plastic trash bag of clothes, a silent ride in a state-issued sedan, and 14 years of scraping by on minimum wage, fighting eviction notices, and eating ramen in cold apartments. Jess walked into the kitchen. The linoleum was curling at the edges. She ran a hand along the counter, wiping away a streak of grime. "All right, Maggie," Jess whispered to the empty room. Let's see what kind of garbage you left me to clean up. The intrusion began the next morning. Jess had spent the night wrapped in her sleeping bag on the living room floor, listening to the house settle. It was a restless, drafty night. By dawn, she was bruised, cold, and nursing a headache. She had just managed to pry open a window to air out the musty stench of the kitchen when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. She walked out to the porch. A pristine jet-black pickup truck was idling in the driveway. It was the kind of truck that had never seen a day of actual labor. The tires were perfectly polished, the bed scratch-free. A man stepped out. He wore a quarter-zip fleece, expensive denim, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He walked up the steps with the unearned confidence of someone used to getting what they wanted. You must be Jessica," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Greg Sullivan, Sullivan Real Estate and Development." Jess looked at his hand, then up at his face. She didn't take it. She crossed her arms over her canvas jacket. "I didn't list the property." Greg chuckled, dropping his hand smoothly. He wasn't embarrassed. I know. Word travels fast in this county. When I heard Margaret had passed, I wanted to come by and pay my respects, and to be completely transparent, to offer you a lifeline." "A lifeline? Let's be honest," Greg said, sweeping a hand toward the collapsing barn. "This place is a money pit. The soil is depleted, the structures are condemned, and the property taxes next year are going to eat you alive. You don't look like a farmer, Jessica." He let his eyes drop for a fraction of a second, taking in her scuffed boots and worn jacket. It was a subtle, calculated insult. "I'm prepared to offer you $150,000, cash," Greg said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "We can close in 5 days. You walk away with a clean slate, no headaches, and enough money to start fresh." Jess stared at him. $150,000. To a guy like Greg, it was a rounding error. To Jess, it was a miracle. It was the end of her credit card debt. It was a reliable car that didn't stall at red lights. It was a down payment on a clean, safe apartment where the heat actually worked. It was freedom. She almost said yes. The word was right there, sitting on her tongue. But Jess had spent her entire adult life at the bottom of the ladder. If there was one thing poverty had taught her, it was how to read predators. When a man in a clean truck offers you a way out, you check the rope for a noose. Greg was trying too hard. His posture was relaxed, but a small muscle in his jaw was twitching. He was eager. He was hungry. 150,000, Jess repeated slowly, for 90 acres of dead dirt and a condemned house. "I have a vision for a subdivision," Greg lied. It was a smooth lie, but a lie nonetheless. "I'm paying for the acreage, not the architecture." "I'll think about it," Jess said. Greg's smile faltered. The mask slipped, just for a millisecond, revealing something cold and sharp underneath. "I wouldn't think too long, Jessica. Offers like this don't sit on the table. In fact, if you sign a letter of intent right now, I'll bump it to 160. "I said I'll think about it, Greg." Jess turned around, walked back into the house and shut the heavy oak door in his face. She locked it. She leaned against the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. Why was he so desperate? You don't offer cash in 5 days for a property that's going to take hundreds of thousands just to clear and grade. There was something he knew, something Margaret knew. Jess pushed away from the door. She wasn't just going to clean the house anymore. She was going to tear it apart. She started in Margaret's study. It was a cramped room off the kitchen, smelling strongly of mothballs and old leather. Bookshelves lined the walls, stuffed with encyclopedias and decades-old farming almanacs. Jess began pulling them down, tossing them onto the floor in a dusty pile. She checked behind the books, ran her hands along the back of the shelves, checked the drawers of the heavy mahogany desk. Nothing but paper clips, dried-out pens, and unpaid utility bills. Frustrated, she sank into the desk chair. The wood creaked loudly. She looked down at the desk blotter. It was thick, green leather, worn smooth in the center. She lifted it. Underneath was a simple, black moleskin notebook. Jess picked it up. The binding was cracked. She opened it, expecting a diary. The rantings of a bitter old woman. Instead, it was a ledger, but it didn't track money. The pages were filled with Margaret's tight, cramped handwriting. They were dates, followed by strange, disjointed coordinates and measurements. October 14th, 2012, North Pasture, 3 paces from the split oak, 6 untouched sealed. April 3rd, 2015, root cellar, east wall behind the preserves, 4 F2 sealed. November 22nd, 2018, silo foundation, south edge, 5 F sealed. Jess frowned, tracing the ink with her thumb. Sealed, 6 feet. She flipped to the back of the book. Taped to the inside of the back cover was a heavy, folded piece of thick parchment. She carefully peeled the tape away and unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of Ashwood Farm. It was incredibly detailed, marking the house, the barns, the fencing, and the tree lines. And scattered across the map were dozens of small, red X's. Jess looked out the window of the study. The rain had finally started to fall, drumming a steady, hollow beat against the glass. She looked toward the north pasture. Through the gray mist, she could just make out the silhouette of a massive oak tree, its trunk split down the middle by an old lightning strike. She looked back down at the ledger. North pasture, 3 paces from the split oak, 6 Umi. Jess didn't know what her grandmother had been doing out there in the dirt. But she knew she wasn't calling Greg Sullivan back. She walked into the mudroom, grabbed a heavy rusted shovel leaning against the wall, and pushed out into the rain. The rain was freezing, driving down in sharp, diagonal sheets that soaked through her canvas jacket in minutes. Mud sucked at Jess's boots, threatening to pull them off with every step. She kept her head down, marching across the ruined pasture, counting her paces from the shattered base of the split oak. 1, 2, 3. She drove the blade of the shovel into the earth. It barely broke the surface. The ground here was a dense network of stubborn roots and packed clay. She put her boot on the shoulder of the shovel and forced her weight down. The blade crunched through a root. Jess started to dig. Within 30 minutes, her hands were slick with rain and blistered. Her shoulders burned with a deep, lactic fire. The hole was only 2 feet deep, rapidly filling with muddy water. She wanted to quit. It was insane. She was a 28-year-old warehouse worker, standing in a freezing downpour, digging a hole because of a dead woman's cryptic diary. Greg Sullivan's check was sitting in the back of her mind, clean and dry and easy. 6 feet, the ledger had read. She wiped a mixture of rain and sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of mud across her skin. She gripped the splintered handle of the shovel and kept digging. 2 hours passed, then 3. The hole was a gaping, muddy crater. Jess was standing in water up to her shins, her breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. Her hands were bleeding, the blisters having popped and rubbed raw against the wood. She raised the shovel and drove it down. Clang! The vibration shot up the wooden handle, jarring her teeth. It wasn't the dull thud of a rock. It was the sharp, undeniable ring of steel. Jess dropped the shovel. She dropped to her knees in the freezing muck, digging furiously with her bare hands. Her fingernails packed with clay. She cleared the mud away, revealing a flat, dark surface. It was heavily wrapped in thick, industrial plastic, sealed with layers of black tape. She clawed at the edges until she found a seam, ripping the plastic back. Beneath it was a military-grade surplus ammo crate. It was painted olive drab, rusted at the hinges but entirely intact. Jess hooked her fingers under the heavy metal latches. They were stiff. She braced her boots against the sides of the hole, pulling with everything she had left. The latches shrieked, protesting the movement, and finally popped open. She lifted the lid. Jess stopped breathing. The rain fell into the box, beating off rows of heavy, dull yellow ingots. They were stamped with banking seals, and weight measurements, tucked tightly beside them, were heavy, vacuum-sealed plastic bags. Through the clear plastic, Jess could see stacks of currency, not modern, colorful bills. Old, green $100 bills, hundreds of them, thousands. She reached out with a trembling, muddy hand and touched one of the gold bars. It was freezing, immensely heavy, and real. "Holy hell," Jess whispered. She didn't know the exact spot price of gold, but she knew what she was looking at. In this single crate, there was easily $500,000, and the map in Margaret's study had dozens of red X's. Jess sat back on her heels in the mud, staring down into the earth. Suddenly, the image of Greg Sullivan's polished truck and eager smile flashed in her mind. I'm prepared to offer you $150,000, cash. He knew. He didn't know exactly where it was, or maybe he didn't know the sheer volume of it, but Sullivan knew the farm was hiding something massive. Margaret had sat on this land for decades, living in squalor, surrounded by a fortune. Sullivan was trying to buy a $15 million vault for pennies, banking on Jess being too desperate and too ignorant to look under the floorboards. A sharp spike of adrenaline cut through her exhaustion. Jess slammed the lid of the crate shut. She couldn't leave it here, but it was too heavy to carry in one trip. She spent the next hour hauling the heavy bars and sealed cash through the rain, hiding them under the floorboards of the mudroom. When the hole was empty, she filled it back in, kicking the wet clay over the void and scattering dead leaves across the top. By the time she locked the front door of the farmhouse, she was shivering violently. She stripped off her ruined clothes, wrapped herself in a dry blanket, and sat on the floor of the study with a map spread out in front of her. She wasn't poor anymore. She was a millionaire. But as the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the property, a pair of headlights swept through the front windows. Jess froze. She crept into the hallway and peered through the dusty glass of the front door. It was a dark SUV, not Sullivan's pristine truck, but something heavier. The vehicle idled at the edge of the driveway just beyond the tree line. Nobody got out. It just sat there, the headlights burning through the rain, watching the house. They were waiting for her to leave. Jess backed away from the door. Her grandmother hadn't just left her money. She had left her a war. The SUV stayed for an hour before quietly backing out onto the highway and disappearing into the night. Jess didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness of the kitchen, gripping a heavy iron fire poker she'd found in the living room, listening to the creak of the old house. As soon as the gray light of dawn crept through the windows, Jess was moving. April 3, 2015, root cellar, east wall behind the preserves, fort. She took a flashlight and a crowbar down the narrow wooden steps into the cellar. The air was thick and tasted like damp earth. Shelves of ancient, blackened mason jars lined the walls. Jess found the east wall. The brickwork here looked slightly newer. The mortar, a lighter shade of gray than the rest of the foundation. She swung the crowbar. The heavy iron bit into the masonry, sending a spray of dust into the air. She swung again, harder. The brick cracked. It took 20 minutes to pull down a 3-foot section of the wall. Behind the bricks, resting in a hollowed-out alcove, was a large, heavy steel safe. It wasn't locked. The dial had been smashed off entirely, leaving only a heavy drop latch. Jess pulled it open. More gold, stacks of pristine, vacuum-sealed bearer bonds, and resting on top of the fortune was a standard white envelope. It had one word written on it in black ink: Jessica. She wiped her dirty hands on her jeans, picked up the envelope, and tore it open. The paper inside was thick, covered in Margaret's sharp, uncompromising handwriting. If you are reading this, you didn't sell out to the first vulture in a suit who knocked on the door. Good. You think I hated you. You think I threw you away. You are wrong. Your grandfather was a quiet man, but he was not a good one. Before he died, he left me the results of a lifetime of illicit logistics. Skimming from armored transports, quietly bleeding syndicate accounts, burying it where no one would look. When your father found out about it, the money became a poison. He was weak. He wanted the easy way out. He put a needle in his arm because he thought there was a safety net waiting to catch him. There wasn't. When he died, they looked at you. The people who knew what your grandfather did. They watched this farm. They watched me. If I had kept you here, if I had loved you where they could see, they would have used you to bleed me dry. I had to make them believe you meant nothing to me. I had to let you go into the system, let you struggle, let you harden. A soft girl cannot hold on to this kind of money. They will take it from her, and they will kill her for it. You had to learn how to survive on nothing, so you would know how to fight for everything. Sullivan is a front. He works for the people your grandfather stole from. He thinks I'm a crazy old hoarder. He thinks you are a desperate, broke kid. Show him he is wrong. The farm is yours. The money is yours. Buy the land back from the devil. Margaret. Jess read the letter 3 times. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold this time, but from a profound, terrifying clarity. 14 years of anger, of feeling abandoned, began to fracture. Margaret hadn't thrown her to the wolves. She had thrown her into the wild so she could learn how to bite back. A heavy thud echoed from the floorboards above her. Jess froze. Someone was in the house. She folded the letter, slipped it into her pocket, and picked up the crowbar. She killed the flashlight, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. She crept silently up the wooden stairs, stopping just before the door that led to the kitchen. She could hear heavy footsteps pacing across the linoleum. Then, the sound of drawers being pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Jess gripped the crowbar tight. She pushed the cellar door open with her shoulder. Greg Sullivan was standing in the middle of the kitchen. The polished veneer was gone. He looked frantic, his fleece jacket dusted with plaster. He was tearing through Margaret's cabinets, throwing plates and old tins onto the floor. He spun around as the cellar door creaked. "Where is it?" Greg demanded. The smooth, wealthy developer voice was gone. He sounded like a thug. "I know," she kept a ledger. "My guys have been watching this place for years. Where's the map, Jessica?" "Get out of my house," Jess said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Greg took a step toward her. He pulled a heavy black handgun from the waistband of his jeans. He didn't point it at her, just held it by his side, a clear and brutal threat. "You don't know what you're dealing with, kid. You take the 150 grand, you walk away, and you get to live. You try to play games with us, you end up buried in the south pasture with the rest of the garbage." Jess didn't flinch. She looked at the gun, then up at Greg's face. He was arrogant, but he was sloppy. He was standing directly over the spot where the linoleum curled. "You're right," Jess said, her grip tightening on the heavy iron crowbar. "I don't know what I'm dealing with, but I know what my grandmother dealt with." Before Greg could raise the gun, Jess lunged. She didn't swing for his head. She swung low, driving the heavy hooked end of the crowbar brutally into his kneecap. Greg screamed, a wet, tearing sound echoing in the small kitchen. His leg buckled instantly, and he collapsed onto the peeling linoleum, dropping the gun as he grabbed his ruined knee. Jess kicked the gun across the floor. It slid under the refrigerator. She stood over him. He was writhing, cursing, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You tell your bosses," Jess said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that the money is gone. It was gone years ago. Margaret spent it all trying to keep this dead farm alive. There is nothing here but dirt." "You're lying," Greg hissed through gritted teeth. Jess raised the crowbar, resting the heavy blood-stained iron gently against his other knee. "Do I look like I'm lying?" Greg stared up at her. He looked into her eyes and saw the 14 years of concrete, of minimum wage, of scraping and fighting and surviving. He saw Margaret's blood. He shook his head slowly. "Get off my land," Jess said. She watched him drag himself out the back door, leaving a smear of blood across the porch. She watched him pull himself into his pristine truck and speed wildly down the driveway, tearing up the gravel as he fled toward the highway. Jess locked the deadbolt. She walked back into the study and looked out the window. The rain had stopped. The heavy gray clouds were breaking apart, letting thin, sharp rays of morning sunlight hit the ruined roof of the main barn. She touched the pocket of her jacket, feeling the crinkle of Margaret's letter. She wasn't going to sell. She was going to hire contractors. She was going to tear down the rotting wood, grade the soil, and rebuild the fences. She was going to dig up every single red X on that map, and she was going to turn Ashwood Farm into a fortress. Jess picked up the phone on the desk. She dialed the lawyer's number. "Neil," she said when he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "It's Jessica." "Jessica, do you know what time it is? Have you decided what to do with the property?" Jess looked out at the 90 acres of mud, weeds, and buried gold. She smiled for the first time in 14 years. "I'm keeping it," she said. "We're going to need a bigger bank." 14 years of struggle prepared her for the ultimate fight. Jess didn't just inherit a fortune. She inherited her grandmother's iron will. What would you do if you found out your hardest days were secretly training you for a multi-million-dollar war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this story of grit, betrayal, and buried treasure, hit that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more thrilling stories every week.